So you can think of these as the micro rivers inside the brain. So one thing that can happen when there's inflammation is that these blue structures, the glial cells, actually swell up and get bigger, which narrows the channel, which means there can be less flow, less microflow. And then the other thing is that if there's already increased or decreased flow of cerebral spinal fluid, what can happen is if I could draw in like little black dots in these spaces, then this creates a situation where more of this plaque and more of this clogging can occur. And so when this happens, it means that a structure like the amyloid plaque inside the brain can clog up the brain. And over time, in the progression of the disease, it means that all the structure becomes non-functional. The glial cells get destroyed, the neurons, the capillaries. So all this becomes non-functional tissue. Now, having said that, what if it were possible, if there's less flow and more inflammation in the glial structure in the perovascular space, what would be possible if we could actually, as the professor said, speed up the deposition and clear out these structures and clear this out? What would be the benefit? Maybe it means it could restore neurological function to a greater degree or prevent it from occurring in the first place. So it's kind of like if you're washing your dishes and you got a part of the dish that needs a little extra scrubbing, you need to put a little more elbow grease in it. Or at the same time, maybe you go through a car wash and you need to hold the nozzle a little closer to get a speck off. It's like, what would be the benefit of speeding up that deposition? So something to think about. So, and this is just a structure. This illustrates aquaporins that I'll talk about more in a minute with a study where we have this subarachnoid space here. This is the blue, and the yellow are aquaporins. They're like structures that are like one-way conductors of fluid, of cerebral spinal fluid, that becomes extracellular fluid that then enters into this perovascular space. So these are microstructures that exist around the periphery of the brain that conduct CSF from the periphery, when I showed you that original drawing, deep inside the structure of the brain. So CSF and clearing amyloid plaque in the brain. So here's an analogy that I've used for many years, starting with my TED Talk some years ago. And it's the idea that you have a river and it's flowing well and freely. But then the water table starts to decrease, and you have less flow of water. Well, by analogy, in the brain, the average healthy adult produces from 600 to 800 milliliters a day of cerebral spinal fluid. At any one time, there's about 125 milliliters or 4 fluid ounces in the brain. And so what if this water table decreases even further and all the mud and sludge and silt dries up the waterbed? This is analogy to what happens when the brain dries up, because what we found in our research is that people with senile dementia have a turnover of cerebral spinal fluid that's 75% less than a normal adult. And that can cause problems because that can contribute to this formation of amyloid plaque in the brain. So that's an analogy to kind of give us an idea of, what's really going on in terms of the mechanism of Alzheimer's. And so our theory that came to light is that these formation of plaques and tangles could be triggered by inflammation in the brain, that there's a technique in cranial psychotherapy called the still point that can help clear inflammation, decrease formation of plaques and tangles, and help the body clear these plaques and tangles in the brain. And so what this still point technique does, just as a little bit of an overview, and this is a technique we've been applying for decades with people around the world. It can help increase blood flow to the brain, increase flow of CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, helps with the flexibility of the central nervous system, and also it's a de-stressor. It helps lower stress, it helps lower blood pressure, cerebral and pulmonary congestion, helps clear metabolic waste, which I've referred to before, helps with headaches and migraines, and helps remove metallic toxins across the blood-brain barrier. And so our proposed ecologic model of Alzheimer's formation, again, just referring back to this, is that the flow of CSF in the brain is significantly correlated with the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and inflammation in the brain also contributes to this decreased flow of CSF. All right. In our model again, that often when we look at the progression of Alzheimer's disease over time, is that these diseases of aging are often preceded, even decades before we even locate a problem with memory. They're preceded maybe by osteoporosis, arthritis, scoliosis, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, ophthalmic or visual problems, immobility and joint stiffness, digestive, short-term memory loss, radiation exposure, cancer, motor vehicle accidents, all of these factors that I mentioned before that can contribute. So they're all something that can kind of pile on. So if you really look at someone who's maybe been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and you go back far enough, you'll find out that, oh, yeah, something might have been going on with mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, even for decades before. They just didn't notice it. They thought it was normal, but these are significant in terms of precursors to this disease process. So that's on the level of the body. And then what happens is that this leads to pockets of localized inflammation in the body. And this also, the immune system's ability to counteract and balance our response to these localized insults. And this begins to fail. And so what happens is this might be exacerbated as another factor by medications whose target is often the suppression of the immune system. Remember the difference between treating symptoms and looking at the cause itself. So this sets the stage for an opportunistic invasion of the blood-brain barrier by factors that promote increased toxicity in the brain. And I'm happy to have this time to speak about it because usually I don't go into this much detail in a lecture virtually to explain all these factors. But here's what can happen in terms of dysfunction of the aging process. This is a little model of this, is that you can have trauma of some sort, and that can in some way, shape, or form contribute to this disease process. That in turn can lead to multi-location inflammatory response in the body. That can compromise the immune system and also affect function and increased flow of cerebral spinal fluid. And then finally, you have an opportunistic invasion across the blood-brain barrier. Remember that SLYM layer that I showed you, that new discovery of an anatomical structure in just the last few months from the University of Rochester. This is something we've been talking about for some time, and now we're looking at structures that kind of reflect that function as well. All right. So inflammation in the body can overflow into the brain. The body will try as hard as it can to not be compromised, or the brain can try as hard as it can not to be compromised until at some point, and fortunately not in all cases, but in a certain percentage of cases, we find this inflammation, this neuroinflammation evidenced in the brain itself. And this is a model of inflammation which corresponds in general to the 3 stages of Alzheimer's, the way I look at it. And this is the following. Think of the formation of Alzheimer's as developing in 3 stages of what's called a pro-inflammatory response. And the first stage is that, and this is where people may not even see anything in terms of a diagnosis, but things have been brewing. So there's toxicity in the blood, in the body. It crosses the blood-brain barrier because that layer, that SOIM layer, falters perhaps, and we get an acute phase response. So the body tries to defend itself by structures embedded within it, and the brain wants to defend itself by structures within the brain called microglia. They're like the local patrol people inside the brain. But if these microglia are overwhelmed at a certain point, then we get to stage 2. And if this APR, or this response, is unchecked, then these amyloid precursor proteins, which are proteins that spread inflammation in and out of cells, they become dysfunctional. They become snipped. and then you get a smaller chain protein structure, which is the amyloid, tau, and gamma plaque, which starts to gunk up, if you will, the perivascular structures in the brain. So that leads to stage 2, where we're actually starting to see problems. People are having memory lapse, maybe they're wandering a little bit. It's like a forest fire that is basically created inside the brain. And then what happens is that immune system factors from outside the brain start to cross the blood-brain barrier, and they unfortunately create their own pro-inflammatory cytokines, they're called. They create a secondary and tertiary situation where there's more inflammation that's created in the brain, even as the body tries to defend itself. And then over time, and this is just a little structure here where I'm going to talk about proteins. I'll go through this really quick. But what happens in stage 3 is there's continued destruction of brain tissue. So in stage 2, when someone's basically needing more 24 hours of care, at that point, the brain looks at, and the immune system looks at the brain like it can't tell the difference between friend and foe. And it's as if the brain almost starts to digest itself. Everything becomes an invader. So not a very happy way to go. So these are like the 3 different stages when we talk about Alzheimer's, and inflammation seems to be a part of the picture. So as I mentioned before, the typical arc of Alzheimer's is 8 to 12 years, and now we're saying we're expanding it to say it's really maybe more around 20 years, okay? And so we're saying if we could intervene at an earlier stage, at early to mid stage, could we change the trajectory and outcomes from certain death and have a better quality of life? And it's as if we're putting out a forest fire, if you want to think of it that way. For anyone that lives in California or other places where there are forests, you know what happens when fire is unchecked. People think it's a little fire at first, but it jumps outside in the campground, the ring where the fire is contained, and you come back 6 hours later, and the whole forest is on fire.